Karl Urban spent 9 years being the most loyal man in the Kelvin Timeline, defending Star Trek publicly, while Paramount privately ran the whole thing into the ground. They never made the film. They never called. And when it was finally over, he found out the same way you did, by reading it in a trade publication. That's not how you treat an actor. That's how you treat furniture. Let's be clear about what actually happened here, because the way this story gets told in the mainstream press completely buries the real outrage. When Paramount's new Skydance merged leadership quietly confirmed in November 2025 that they were moving on from the Kelvin Timeline, no Chris Pine, no Zachary Quinto, no Zoe Saldana, no Karl Urban, it wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a statement. It wasn't even a tweet. It was a footnote buried inside a Variety profile about David Ellison's first 100 days running the studio. That's where Karl Urban learned his tenure as Dr. Leonard McCoy was finished. Not from a phone call, not from a meeting, from a trade magazine, sandwiched between notes about corporate restructuring and streaming strategy. That's the level of respect Paramount had for a man who gave them 9 years of public loyalty and not a single critical word in return. And here's what makes it genuinely infuriating. Urban earned better than that. He is not an actor who stumbled into this franchise by accident. He is a lifelong Star Trek fan who actively pursued the role of Dr. McCoy when J.J. Abrams was casting the 2009 reboot. He didn't need convincing. He didn't negotiate his way into loving the character. He showed up already knowing who Bones was, already understanding the weight of following DeForest Kelley, and he delivered a performance so precisely calibrated that Abrams reportedly gave him one single note across the entire production: keep doing exactly what you're doing. One note. The kind of directorial feedback you give an actor who arrived on set is already completely right, and the fan base felt it immediately. Urban's McCoy became one of the most celebrated aspects of the Kelvin Timeline, the grumpy, brilliant, deeply human counterweight to Pine's Kirk and Quinto's Spock. He was the soul of the Enterprise, and Paramount treated him like a line item. But to understand just how badly they disrespected him, you have to look at what happened in the 9 years between Beyond and that Variety footnote. Because that timeline is not just a story of bad luck, it is a masterclass in institutional dysfunction. Star Trek Beyond came out in August 2016. It made $343 million worldwide. Not a phenomenon, but not a failure either. A solid number for a franchise film that had genuine critical support and a passionate fan base. And before the theatrical run had even ended, Paramount announced that Star Trek IV was in development. The cast would be returning. The band was getting back together. It was great news. Except nobody told the band. Karl Urban found out the same way the rest of the world did, from reporters asking him about it at press junkets. His response to Variety, when directly asked about the announcement, is one of the most revealing quotes in this entire saga. "I haven't seen a script, I know nothing." Not, "We're in early conversations." Not, "I can't say too much yet." Just, "I know nothing." Because he genuinely didn't. Paramount had announced his involvement in a major motion picture to the global entertainment press without making a single phone call to the man whose face was going on the poster. That is not a miscommunication. That is a studio treating its own cast like props in a PowerPoint deck for investors. You announce the asset. You figure out whether the asset is available later. Karl Urban. The asset was apparently not a priority in that sequence. And then the directors started cycling through. S.J. Clarkson was hired in 2018 and left when pay negotiations collapsed. Chris Pine and Chris Hemsworth walked over contract disputes, and the whole production fell apart before a single scene was shot. Then Noah Hawley came in with an entirely original concept that had almost nothing to do with the Kelvin crew. Then Quentin Tarantino pitched an R-rated Star Trek, which honestly sounds absolutely unhinged, but at least it was interesting, with a screenplay from the Revenant writer Mark L. Smith. Then came Matt Shakman, who got closer than anyone. Sound stages were booked, crew was hired, a 2022 production start was planned until Marvel called about Fantastic Four and he walked. Because when Marvel calls, you pick up. At least Marvel actually makes movies. Through all of this, every director, every collapsed deal, every fresh announcement, Karl Urban kept showing up. As recently as May 2022, he was still telling journalists that it was happening, that they were writing a script, that the cast all wanted to come back. "I've been hearing that for the last 3 years," he said with a laugh that was probably doing a lot of emotional work at that moment. He defended it. He championed it. He kept the faith publicly long after any rational reading of the situation suggested the faith was no longer warranted. That is either extraordinary loyalty or extraordinary naivety. Given how sharp Urban is in interviews, it was loyalty. It was a man who genuinely believed that eventually someone at Paramount would get their act together and make the film they kept promising. They never did, and when the end finally came, it arrived not as a conversation but as a footnote. No call, no courtesy, just a sentence in a trade profile confirming that the studio had moved on. 9 years, 1 sentence. That's the math Paramount did on Karl Urban's tenure in the franchise, and they didn't even have the basic decency to tell him to his face. That's not the ending a man like Urban deserved. But here's what makes it worse. It was completely, entirely, 100% avoidable. Here is the thing about Karl Urban's McCoy that Paramount's new leadership apparently never stopped to consider. You cannot replace him. This is not a hyperbolic fan statement. This is a structural reality of how that ensemble worked. The reason the Kelvin Timeline resonated, the reason the 2009 film is still one of the best franchise reboots ever made, is because of the specific chemistry between Pine, Quinto, and Urban. That triumvirate wasn't just 3 actors playing iconic roles, it was 3 completely distinct philosophical positions in conversation with each other. Action and instinct versus logic and discipline versus gut feeling and humanity. Remove any one of those elements and the whole architecture collapses. Urban was the conscience of the Enterprise, the moral friction, the guy who pushed back when Kirk was being reckless and Spock was being cold. That role, in the specific way Urban played it, made the crew feel real. You don't recast that. You start over. And starting over costs you everything the previous version built. And now look at what Paramount has actually got. On the film side, a blank page. Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley, the writers best known for Game Night, are building an entirely new Star Trek universe from scratch. 0 continuity. 0 established characters. 0 of the audience investment that 3 Kelvin films spent a decade accumulating. On the streaming side, Starfleet Academy launched in January 2026 with a 35% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, spent its entire season being rejected by the core fan base while critics handed out 88% like participation trophies, and finished its run still unable to close that 53-point gap between what the press was saying and what actual Star Trek fans were feeling. Discovery is over. Section 31 landed with a thud and vanished. The entire streaming universe that was supposed to carry the franchise forward while the films were being developed is sitting on a foundation that the fanbase simply does not trust. Karl Urban watched all of this from the outside. He watched the franchise he loved, the one he signed onto before reading the full script because he trusted the people involved, get handed to a succession of directors who never shot a frame, executives who announced his involvement without telling him, and a streaming strategy that kept missing the point of what made Star Trek matter in the first place. He was loyal through all of it. He didn't go to the press with grievances. He didn't drop pointed quotes in interviews about feeling disrespected. He kept saying he wanted to come back. He kept saying the cast was the best hang. He kept the door open long after Paramount had stopped knocking. And then they closed it for him, without a phone call, without a conversation, without even the basic professional respect of telling him directly that it was done. That's the betrayal. Not dramatic, not loud, just quietly, institutionally, completely inexcusable. Here's what you need to understand about Karl Urban's place in this whole story. The headline version, the actor loses franchise role, makes it sound like a normal piece of Hollywood turnover. Contracts expire, studios reboot, that's the business. But that framing completely misses what actually happened here. Karl Urban did not lose a franchise role. He was a genuine fan of Star Trek who pursued the role, landed it, delivered one of the most praised performances in the reboot era, and then spent 9 years being the franchise's most consistent public defender, while the studio that owned it ran it through a revolving door of directors, collapsed a production over contract disputes it should have resolved before making any public announcements, and ultimately confirmed his departure in a trade footnote rather than a conversation. He gave Paramount his loyalty, his patience, his public goodwill, and his silence when it would have been very easy and completely justified to say something sharp. And what did Paramount give him in return? A decade of development limbo, a franchise reboot announcement he learned about from journalists, and a confirmation that it was over buried inside a business profile he probably had to be texted a link to by someone on his team. That is not how you treat a man who called Star Trek the best hang of his career. That is how you treat someone you never actually valued and just didn't bother hiding it clearly enough until the end. Karl Urban wasn't disloyal to Star Trek. He was loyal to a fault, and Paramount exploited every last bit of it. The franchise didn't lose him. It discarded him. And any version of Star Trek that gets built on the other side of this wreckage will be carrying the weight of that decision, whether anyone at the studio wants to acknowledge it or not.